famous historical events that never actually happened. This is actually a pretty interesting idea. I want to know things that didn't happen. Things that we often repeat. But I have to pee. Why does everyone say I peed so loud? Are you actually hearing it or is it like a joke? There's no way you're actually hearing me pee from that far away. There's 2 doors in between. That's crazy if you can actually hear it. I have to watch the VOD. I can't trust you guys. You're probably lying. He aims straight for the water, SMH. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to aim for the water when you pee. You don't aim for the side of the bowl. It increases your chance of splash. Let's hear about famous historical events.
That
didn't actually happen.
Actually happened. All right, this is a big one. Einstein failing.
Someone said you got to pee through the legs. What does that mean? How is that possible? How would you be able to pee through the legs? Like reverse it? Like, you turn around, ass facing the bowl, and then why? You're not getting points. That just seems messy, bro. It's called a trick shot. All right. Good for you, I guess. Let's hear about this, okay, Einstein.
Math in high school.
We haven't gotten
this trope has been used by underachievers since the middle of the 20th century to excuse.
Einstein did not fail math in high school. I thought that was true. I didn't think it was because he was bad at math. I thought maybe he was too good or something, but I thought he did fail math.
Use their crappy grades. Hey mom, you should be happy with that D I got in math. Even Einstein failed math. You could even say I'm smarter than Einstein. Hate to break it to you, but it's not true. You better get used to making those fries. Einstein was a mathematical genius, pretty much from the jump. By age 12, he was studying algebra and geometry on his own. And by 14 or 15, he was already delving into calculus, several years ahead of most of his peers. The struggles that he did have in school were with subjects that required a rigid rote-style learning, like history and French.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
No one's sure the myth originated.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. I thought he failed math class because he was way ahead, or like it was too boring for him, so he didn't do any of the work. But well, I guess I'm wrong. In my mind, that was true, but I guess it's not.
Exactly, but the best theory suggests that it came from the fact that Einstein went to school in Switzerland, and the Swiss use a grading system from 1 to 6, with 6 being the best grade and 1 being the worst. And that was the opposite of the rest of Europe, where 1 was the top grade. Einstein himself even addressed this myth in an article in the Times magazine. When shown a clipping claiming he had failed math, he reportedly laughed and said, "I have never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." Terrible news for the slackers. In the US...
Okay, don't brag so much, Einstein. Jesus Christ. Have some humility. I didn't know Einstein was so arrogant, dude. I was on the same pace as Einstein, but I became a Twitch viewer instead. So you mastered calculus by an early age, but then decided instead of inventing new theorems, you would watch my channel. So you're saying if you don't invent anything great in your life, it's my fault. And you would be the next Einstein if it wasn't for me polluting your brain. Well, that's what I'm doing Get Smarter Saturday. I'm trying to get you back on track.
School children are taught from an early age that the courageous Christopher Columbus set off on an epic journey to prove that the Earth was round and not flat. Cool story, but completely inaccurate. In reality, Columbus had the idea in his head that the Atlantic Ocean was much smaller than was commonly thought, and that he could sail east on the Atlantic and find a shortcut to Asia. In fairness to Chris, people had only known the Earth was round for about 2,000 years. As early as the 6th century BCE, Greek philosophers like Pythagoras speculated that the Earth was round, and later in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle noted that the Earth casts a round shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse.
Okay,
and that the travelers going south see new constellations rise in the sky, both of which are consistent with a spherical planet. And in the 3rd century BCE, the Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using simple geometry. His estimate was around 25,000. Pretty good guess, since the real number is roughly 24,901 miles.
That's pretty incredible.
And given that he was using pretty much just sticks, that is insanely impressive. So what did Chris actually prove? Mainly, he proved that when it came to guessing the size of the Atlantic Ocean or how to get to Asia, he pretty much sucked. Although technically you could get to Asia by sailing east from Spain.
I don't understand, just what gave him the impression, on no evidence at all, that it was actually not that far to get to Asia from Spain. Why did he? What vibes made him think it was smaller than he thought? Unironically, just vibes. That's just crazy. Be like, yeah, we're gonna just get in this boat and sail for months off of vibes. The wave spoke to him.
Your path is going to be going through North, South, and Central America. The scholars of the day theorized the ship couldn't take enough supplies to make the journey. Had Columbus not landed on Cuba, there's no question that he and his crew would have run out of supplies a long time before they got to Asia. From the time they enter grade school, American children are taught about 6-year-old George Washington.
So you carry enough supplies, right, for a certain number of days. Let's say you have 300 days worth of supplies. After day 150, if you're still sailing, now you don't have enough supplies to get back. Do you just turn around, or do you keep listening to Christopher Columbus and try to bink it? Like, yeah, now you're getting desperate. Now it's all in. Get supplies when you land, but you don't know when you're going to land. You don't know how far it is. Everyone in chat that's spamming run it, play it, let's fucking go. If it was real life on the boat, you'd be like, I'm hungry. Chris, I'm hungry. Why don't we turn back? I'm hungry. This is a dumb idea. Like, none of you would actually live by your principles, bro. You would be so, I'm fucking hungry.
Receiving an axe as a gift, and then going out and chopping down his father's cherry tree. When his father asked who did it, because, yeah, apparently seeing a 6-year-old boy holding a hatchet that was dripping with cherry tree sap wasn't enough of a clue, sap. Young George replied, I cannot tell a lie. You know I cannot tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet, and instead of getting angry...
I love this story. Because the idea that a parent would come home, see their kid holding an axe, see a tree chopped down, and the kid would think he could lie their way out of it. It's like, even if this were true, it's not that impressive. You're caught red-handed. They got you. Whether you lie or not, you're caught. You might as well. It's not like this brilliant moment of truth.
His father gave him such a big old hug and told George how proud he was to have an honest son. Before we get to how this story isn't true at all, can we start with the obvious question?
Say that?
Namely, who in the hell gives an axe to a 6-year-old child? I know gift options were a lot more limited back then. No video games, no Hot Wheels. But an axe? What did the grandfather of America think was gonna happen? Anyway, this whole cherry tree thing wasn't told as a true story, but as a simple way to create basically a fable. Since the USA was a young nation, there was a desire in those early days to transform from historical individuals into almost mythical heroes. And who better to go all mythy on than the leader of the Continental Army and the first president? The cherry tree story first appeared in a book written by Mason Locke Weems in 1800, just a year after Washington.
That's crazy how long that has stuck around and become part of American folklore. Just based off someone ripping it. It's like, this guy called his shot. I'm going to make a fable that becomes part of American society. And he just did it. This is Jason the Ween's grandpa. That's correct.
Washington's death. And the first clue that the story was BS? This was the 5th edition of the book, but the first time the cherry tree was mentioned. Anyway, yeah, just crazy how it got so popular. The Chicago Fire. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is one of the most infamous disasters in American history, taking over 300 lives and leaving over 100,000 residents homeless. And if you remember hearing about the fire, it's almost certainly because you know the story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern and kicking off the whole shebang. And since buildings in the 1800s were mainly constructed of dry wood and oily rags, it didn't take long for the bovine blaze to grow, eventually jumping the Chicago River and destroying much of downtown Chicago. And how did the cow get the blame for this horrific event? Well, by now you may not be surprised to find out it was completely made up by an unscrupulous newspaper reporter who was looking for clicks. Or, as they called it back then, selling newspapers.
Fake news.
The story had 4 of the things that Americans hated the most. Mrs. O'Leary was poor, she was Irish, she was Catholic, and last of all, she was a woman. People were looking for a convenient...
There's this big disastrous fire. Everyone's kind of pissed off. How can we blame it on a poor Irish Catholic woman? Really her cow, though.
Convenient scapegoat, and Catherine O'Leary checked all the boxes. The story's main promoter was a journalist named Michael Ahern, who later admitted that he made up the whole cow kicking the lantern detail to spice up his report. But that admission was too little too late, because the cow story had already taken hold and started to grow some seriously deep roots. Yeah. Many investigations were done in the following years, but the exact cause could never be determined. They did establish that the fire began near or in the O'Leary's barn, but there is no solid evidence that Catherine O'Leary or her cow had anything to do with it. Wait, Catherine always said that she was...
So it did start near her barn. It's not even that fake, bro. In fact, it sounds like she did it and the cow wasn't at fault. Those damn Irish Catholic women are always starting fires. Atrioc, you were there? Yeah, I was in Chicago at that time, but I was pissed drunk and I just stumbled into somebody's farm and I started lighting cigarettes. So it couldn't have been me, okay?
In bed when the fire started. For all we know, it could have been careless smoking by a goat or a grease fire in the kitchen by one of the pigs. Over time, historians have come up with a couple of pretty solid theories about the fire. Refreshingly, neither theory involves any sort of farm animal. First, maybe neighborhood boys started out while sneaking a cigarette. That makes sense, because in the 1870s, all those 8-year-old boys wanted to do after a grueling 12-hour workday in the factory was come back home and enjoy a nice, relaxing cigarette. The other theory sounds a little bit wacky, but it's plausible. A meteor shower could have sparked fires across the region, in Michigan and Wisconsin. Unlike a lot of completely made-up myths, the story of Isaac Newton and the apple has a tiny bit of truth to it. The story we've all heard is that Newton's lounging in his garden, sometime in the 1660s. Suddenly an apple falls, bonks him in the head, and voila! Newton immediately had the fully formed universal law of gravitation ready to publish. The truth is, as Newton said later in life, he was sitting in his garden after dinner, drinking tea underneath an apple tree. When he saw an apple fall to the ground, he began to think about the force that made the apple fall straight down, not side to side and not at an angle. But it wasn't a eureka moment. It was just one step on a journey that would take over 20 years and culminate with the publication of his Principia Mathematica in 1687. There was a lot more to it than getting smacked by an apple. Nero. Everyone's seen some variation of Nero, the crazed Roman emperor, wildly fiddling as you watch Rome.
That one seems pretty true then. I mean, I don't think anyone actually thought that he wrote it all down instantly. It was like that it inspired. That one seems like roughly true. You did? You thought he shouted, Eureka, I've got it. By the way, why does it take 20 years? Like, I see something fall and I go, okay, that's gravity. Done. That's done. You know, I just get it. I guess I just get it quicker than fucking
burn. It's an image that's seared in our brains, and the expression can be heard even today. But there are a couple reasons why we know this powerful image is
Isaac Newton low-key slow. That's what I'm saying, bro. Like, I didn't want to call him out, but it feels like it kind of took him longer than the rest of us. Like, I feel like we all knew about gravity before age 20. We were able to figure it out pretty fucking quick. Okay? And Isaac Newton took a long time as an adult. It just feels a little bit
completely made up. First of all, the fire that destroyed about 2/3 of Rome happened in 64 CE, roughly 1,000 years before the violin was invented. If you were playing anything, he likely would have been playing a kithara, kind of lyre. And if he had been playing it that day, he would have been playing it at his villa in Antium, since most historians agree he wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. The earliest and most detailed accounts of the fire come from Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. All three of them wrote long after Nero's death, and their writing reflects a mixture of facts, hearsay, and moral judgment. Tacitus, writing about 50 years after the death of the emperor, reports on the rumors at the time that Nero started the fire to clear the way for a huge palace. At the same time, he notes that Nero wasn't even in Rome at the time, and when he got word of the fire, quickly came back to Rome to coordinate relief efforts, and opened his palaces.
Even the most insane emperor would not burn down 2/3 of the city to make room for a big palace. What kind of palace is big enough to cover 2/3 of the city? You put the rest of the city in 1/3? No, not even Donald Trump. Jerome Powell would. I guess he does want a big palace.
Refugees and arrange food supplies. It even seems like tales of Nero's exploits have been exaggerated for effect, because he was a very unconventional ruler who acted on stage, raced chariots, and fancied himself.
Okay, I'm sorry. One person would do this, but he wasn't alive at the time, and it's Dan Clancy. Dan Clancy not only would do this, he did do this in Clancyville. He does 2/3 of Clancyville is just. It's a city 10 million strong, and they all live in a 1/3 slum, really, while Clancy's villa is enormous. So I guess there's some truth that it could happen, but it seems pretty rare.
All scandalous for a Roman emperor. His supposed performance during the fire was probably meant to be symbolic. The narrative,
the Clancy villa,
caught fire because it fit the existing stereotype of a decadent ruler more interested in art than beauty.
If you will.
Marie Antoinette.
Yeah,
many factors contributed to the French Revolution, but the reports of Marie Antoinette responding with "let them eat cake" when she was told the peasants were out of bread did not help. It summed up the attitude of the aristocracy and showed them to be completely out of touch with the common citizens. There's just one tiny problem.
What did she actually say?
She almost definitely did not say it.
Almost?
The actual phrase shown here, which literally means "let them eat brioche," was first seen in this book. In this book, Rousseau recounts an anecdote about a great princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, said they could eat brioche instead. The problem is, in 1767, Marie was still living in Austria, and she was 12 years old. The quote is probably about an entirely different figure, maybe Maria Theresa of Spain or another 18th century royal. Marie was known for her extravagant lifestyle and was called Madame Deficit because her spending occurred at a time when France was seriously in debt. Making a scapegoat of Marie was a lot easier than dealing with the real causes like war debts and a broken tax system. There's also a chance she got a pretty bad rap because
our country's in debt because women be shopping. France is ruined. Because women be shopping, dude. Madam Deficit is very funny.
While she did have a pretty bougie lifestyle, that was kind of expected from the actual queen of a major country. But she also engaged in acts of charity and showed concern for the welfare of not just her children, but also the poor. She donated to orphanages, patronized hospitals, and even tried to reform the court's extravagances. And in the end, none of that mattered. You could argue that "let them eat cake" was one of the first memes, and like a lot of memes out there today, it didn't matter if it was true or not, it only mattered that a huge number of people believed it. Unlike most modern day memes, this one had real consequences, especially for Marie and her husband. They woke up in the morning with their heads firmly attached to their bodies and ended the day with their heads in a basket.
That's an L.
The War of Worlds broadcast. On October 30th, 1938,
this isn't true?
People who tuned into CBS radio heard something that they were not expecting.
Wait, I don't even want to hear about it. This is true. This is a funny story. I wanted to keep this in my mind. I didn't know this wasn't true. The truth's going to ruin my life. You never heard of this? I thought this was like a real true story that people got fooled. Oh, man.
An invasion from Mars. Although if you tuned in at the beginning, you heard a disclaimer from the young director of the Mercury Theater, Orson Welles, telling everyone that this was just an adaptation of his novel, The War of Worlds. They also announced it about halfway through, but by that time, people were too busy crowding the roads trying to escape or jumping out of windows, because they obviously didn't want to fight the aliens. At least that's what the newspapers wanted you to believe. Wells, who was just 23 at the time, was the creative force behind the Mercury Theater on the Air, a weekly dramatic radio program. He wanted to do a modernized version of The War of the Worlds,
the original streamer,
showing it as a series of live news bulletins interrupting regular programming. The reports became more and more frantic as they reported on explosions from Mars, a strange cylinder found in New Jersey, and finally increasing death and destruction as the invaders made their way across New Jersey, unleashing death rays and poison gas. In fairness, that doesn't sound too different from modern-day New Jersey. It's been pointed out this was far from something that everyone was listening to. Most estimates place the War of the Worlds audience at under 1 million listeners, which is a fraction of the country's population. Okay. So why did the newspapers exaggerate the response and how many people were freaking out? We can sum it up in one word: fear. The newspaper owners figured that if they could show how radio inflamed listeners and caused unnecessary panic, people would stop listening and come back to the newspapers. That was a pretty funny theory considering it did exactly the opposite. And if you think about it, that was very ironic. The media is trying to freak people out with half-truths and fake news just to get more engagement. Sure is lucky we don't fall for that kind of stuff anymore. Anyway, it's time to talk about Jesus. Before we talk about Jesus,
what is this graph meant to show? This isn't even labeled. This just shows that as the years go up, the number goes up. The number of what? The number of lies? So we only had 550 lies in 2022? What does this mean? I don't know, but it's provocative.
Anymore? Anyway, it's time to talk about Jesus. Before we talk about Jesus likely not being born on December 25th, rest assured, you can still sing carols, wear ugly sweaters, and totally burn your coworkers in the White Elephant gift exchange. And you can still do all those things in December. But if you want to change your Christmas celebration to spring or late fall, I'm not here to judge. Bible scholars have long debated the exact date of Jesus' birth. For a book that isn't shy about voicing an opinion on just about everything, it's remarkably silent about when the main character was born. Well, at least the main character who shows up in the second act. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which are the only ones that talk about Jesus' birth, don't...
Is there hard evidence that Jesus was a real person? That like a person actually lived named Jesus? Let's find out, because I honestly can't trust chat. The overwhelming consensus among historians is that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person who lived in the first century and was really crucified by the Romans. There's both Christian and non-Christian sources that refer to him, including writings by Roman historians like Tacitus, okay, and Jewish historian Josephus. Seems like he was real. I thought I hallucinated him when I got really high that one time in 1 BC. The OG chiller.
Mention a month or a date or a season, but here's what they do say. Luke mentions that shepherds were in the fields tending their flocks at night when the angel announced Jesus' birth. But December would have been a weird time for shepherds to be out with their flocks. It was cold, the footing was often treacherous, and that was typically a time where the sheep would likely be under the cover of winter or sheepfolds. Of course, because it's religion, not everyone agrees. The Eastern Orthodox Church celebrated on January 6th, and others celebrated in the spring or fall, like March 25th, April 6th, or like September. So why the 25th? Well, the kids are out of school, travel's often treacherous, and everyone looks better in a sweater. Or another explanation is that the Christians and Roman Emperor Constantine kind of borrowed the date from two very popular pagan holidays.
Yeah, they just took the pagan holidays, right?
Which honored the sun god and took place around the winter solstice, and Saturnalia, a week-long festival of gift-giving, feasting, and general debauchery that ended around December 23rd. And by repurposing those holidays, they hope to convert some more people to the cause and celebrate the Son of God instead of the sun. The Salem Witch Trials. When people
Not
think
real?
of the Salem Witch Trials, the image that's most likely to come to mind is some unfortunate woman tied to a stake with the flames growing higher and higher as the bloodthirsty crowd roars with approval. Even though the US wasn't officially a country yet, this chapter in their history was a black mark for the colonies and served to show what happens when rumor, hysteria, and religious fervor are allowed to spread like wildfire among the population.
That's how we stopped it.
Maybe
Then
a
and
bit too
there.
soon for that one. It all started when several young girls began exhibiting strange, convulsive behavior. They claimed they were being tormented by witches. The girls accused local women of practicing witchcraft, and panic spread like wildfire.
Okay.
Last one, I promise. And soon the courts were overwhelmed with cases. And when we're talking about hysteria, it was go big.
Is this like some cattiness? Was this some girls bullying another girl? Like saying she was a witch?
Or go home in Salem. From February 1692 to May 1693, 200 people were accused of witchcraft, 30 were convicted, and 20 were executed. But here's the surprising part. No one was burned at the stake. That was more of a European punishment. Think Joan of Arc. But unlike the Beatles or Rolling Stones, it never really caught on in the US.
Okay.
So in a real good news, bad news situation, the convicted witches were still executed. They just did it by hanging instead. Well, 19 of the 20 were hanged. The 20th was a man named Miles Corey, who was pressed to death with heavy stones.
He
for
was a
refusing to enter
witch?
a plea. You gotta admit, what the Puritans lacked in fairness and common sense, they made up for in coming up with unique and especially sadistic punishments. So why is Salem associated with the burning of witches? As we talked about earlier, burning was big in places like Germany, Scotland, and France. Thousands of people, mainly women, were burned at the stake during the 15th through 17th centuries after being accused of witchcraft. One place where that didn't happen was England. The Brits preferred hanging because, you know, they're classy like that.
Yeah.
The tradition became jumbled with
Why
the
would
story
they
of
have
Salem.
cowboy hats?
Later generations began to assume that the notorious witch trials in New England must have followed the same gruesome rituals. And then pop culture grabbed hold. Films, books, plays, and even Halloween decorations. All picturing scenes of women in colonial garb being tied to stakes and set ablaze. Yep. Paul Revere time.
Interesting.
Paul Revere wore a lot of hats.
Not
Well,
real?
he probably just wore that one tricorn hat, but he had a lot of different jobs. Revere was a silversmith, engraver, and big-time patriot who was part of the Sons of Liberty. The group you may remember from a little thing called the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah.
And on the night of April 18th, 1775, Revere was tasked with riding from Boston to Lexington. His job was to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that British troops were marching to arrest them and to seize military supplies stockpiled by colonial militias.
Okay.
But Paul wasn't the only rider who had that job. William Dawes was given a different route out of Boston a little earlier than Revere, in case one of them was captured.
Okay.
Once they met up in Lexington by Dr. Samuel Prescott, a local physician who just happened to be out late visiting his fiancée. And shortly after they met up, the trio encountered a British patrol. Dawes escaped, but was forced to abandon his horse and walk back. Paul was
Okay.
interrogated and released, also without his horse. In fact, only the doctor was the one who made it through.
Oh, he didn't
So
have a
why do we
horse.
only know about Paul Revere? We have Washington Irving to thank for that. In 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, the poet wanted to fire up the country and inspire unity and patriotism. His poem began, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." What's not to love? It's catchy, it rhymes, and it sounds a lot better than "Listen, my children, and try not to talk. I'll tell you the story of the doc." Catherine the Great. Throughout history,
Okay,
readers
wait.
have met with
But so it did happen. It just was more than one person. Yeah, it was a real event. Okay. It just had more than one rider. Well, that's fine. Paul Revere was probably the Chad of the group anyway. He was kind of like the hog rider of his day.
some untimely and bizarre deaths, but it would be hard to top the story of the demise of Catherine the Great of Russia. You might know what I'm talking about. The story of how Catherine met her demise while attempting to build a more intimate relationship with a horse.
What?
One of the most popular accounts describes her as lying on a platform and then the horse slipped and she was crushed to death. By the way, if you've never heard the story, I'm sorry for giving you the visual. That will be in your head forever. But here's the deal. It never happened. Horses are known for their stability, and it would be very unlikely to just slip. I'm joking, that's not the ridiculous part. She actually died of a stroke at age 67 while on the toilet, just like Elvis. Thank you. Thank you very much. So where did the story of horse-related death start? It's actually just a story as old as time. Pissed off white guys who were jealous of her success as Empress of Russia. She took over after her husband, Peter III, was deposed in the coup. She ruled for 35 years and was known for her forward thinking. She was a huge factor in
Oh, I
modernizing
see.
Russia. But this was
They just called her horse fucker. That's crazy.
also a time when women were expected to be modest, obedient, and domestic. And Catherine was none of those things. She thought for herself, wouldn't back down, and worst of all, was very open with her sexuality and had numerous partners. In other words, she was a huge threat to the patriarchy. and the myth was created to punish her, even after her death, transforming her reputation as a respected monarch into that of a grotesque figure of ridicule. This myth kind of shows a familiar pattern in which powerful women are often demonized.
Interesting.
Cleopatra, Mary Queen of Scots, Marie Antoinette, and many others have been subjected to pretty similar rumors. Anyway, if you like this video,
Interesting. Maybe that's why you guys say glizzy hands about me. You know, it's like you feel like I'm a threat to the patriarchy. Like I'm trying to upend things and change the world, and you guys are you're just making up this glizzy hand story to try and bring me down. You're a threat to the atriarchy in a way. That was pretty good.